In this lesson, we'll talk about tabs. Tabs provide a way to organize a lot of items in one screen without the user having to scroll. Setting up tabs in Android is a bit complicated and very different from Microsoft approaches, so let's get to it. I've already created the project, so you won't have to watch me type. Let's take a look at the layout. I would recommend that you don't use the Visual Designer to add a tab host. It makes a bit of a mess and the code it generates won't run. So we'll take a look at the XML source, and I've added a tab host, and within that tab host there is a linear layout. And there are going to be two things in this vertical linear layout: the actual tab widget, where we're going to have tab indicators, and the frame layout. And the frame layout is where the actual content of the page that the tab reflects is going to be shown. The rest of it we actually do in C# code. Now there are a couple of approaches that you can use. You can associate a view with a tab, like a text view, or an entire activity that allows you to do more. So we'll do activities, and the first thing we need is some resources for our activities. So I've created a couple of resources, a contact activity and a name entry. I'm going to make a main activity that has two tabs, one for the name entry and one for the contact entry. I also need activities for these resources, so I have a first tab activity and a second tab activity, and at this point they don't actually do anything but display the resource. Now if we look at activity 1, which is going to be our main activity and the activity that contains the tabs, the first thing is that instead of descending from activity, it has to descend from tab activity. And then that way we'll be able to get to our tab hosts and everything will run properly. We will create a tab host spec, and this is going to be the specification for each one of the tabs. And a thing called an intent. Now we'll get into intents a lot more, but an intent is basically the intention to run an activity. So I'm going to associate activities with intents. So to create my first tab, I'll create an intent using the first tab activity. I'll add flags to indicate that it's a new task and I'm not rerunning an old activity or anything like that. And then I'll create the spec. And it's going to be a new spec, and it'll have the name. And then I'll set an indicator. An indicator is the actual visual on the tab. And there can be two pieces to this: the actual text shown on the tab and a drawable resource. Now you'll note that I didn't actually add any drawable resources. I just have the icon. But I'm calling out a pre-established Android resource. In this case it's a IC menu info details. So Android actually ships with a few standard resources that you can use. I create the second tab in basically the same way, using the second tab activity. I'm going to call this one contact info, and I use a phone call resource for my drawable on the tab. And finally, I add the tab to the tab host. So let's see what this looks like when it runs. So here's my name activity, and there's the little resource for the information, and my contact info tab and its little resource. And you can see that the activities within the screens reflect the resources that I had set up. One thing that I should point out: each one of these tabs does have a save button on the bottom of it. Each activity is actually independent of each other. They don't know anything about each other the way this is presently set up. When we do talk about activities and intents, we'll find out how to pass data from activities to other activities.